Hello, and welcome to this lecture concerning the linked historical concepts of agency and contingency. This is the final lecture of our module on how historians think. Agency is the idea that history is about human actions as opposed to the actions of providence or nature or of things appearing to occur for no reason. People as a whole, as well as individuals, possess agency, which is to say that they act to create history. Thus, you can refer to people as agents or as historical actors. Because everything has a history, let's look a bit more at the intellectual history of this idea of agency. Agency is an idea rooted in modernism, the dominant philosophical system in the Western world during the 20th century. Modernism emerged from the Enlightenment and is a more direct mechanism by which we explain human progress. I don't want to dive down into the rabbit hole of philosophy at this time, so suffice it to say that my general approach to historical methods is to combine the empiricism of modernism and its expression of agency with the postmodern recognition that our sources about the past, as well as ourselves, are seriously flawed, thus eliminating the possibility of objectivity. But let's look at how agency is modernist. First, it assumes people have a more or less fixed identity in reality, that they consider themselves fixed units of reality that can and do understand how they exist, if not why they exist. Furthermore, individuals have, as historian Alan Munson notes in the Rutledge Companion to Historical Agencies, a, quote, capacity for purposeful choice, unquote. Thus, agency indicates that people make choices. Sometimes it's easier to see something in relief, so I want to touch on the postmodern argument against agency. Postmodernism does not concern itself with empirical methods of knowing. That is, it tends to deny that we can know the past through evidence because that evidence and the sources that contain it are constructed, so they are inadequate. Not only is language inadequate to capture the past, but people are, quote, cut adrift by the inadequacy of language, unquote, and lose their fixed identity. They cannot know themselves, nor can they know the past as it actually occurred. But we're not yet postmodernists, so let's proceed with the understanding that people's actions are the stuff of history, and that we can know what the people of the past did more or less, even while we accept the inadequacy of our own sources and even the hammerlock that language itself can place on our perceptions. We'll accept, at least for the nonce, that people have enough self-identity and, quote, capacity for purposeful choice, unquote, that we benefit from studying their actions in the past. Therefore, agency means we study and interpret the things people did and the choices they made. Accepting agency leads us to a writing convention that most of us struggle with, using the active voice rather than the passive voice. When you use active voice, you spotlight your historical subject's agency and responsibility. Passive voice emphasizes the act rather than the agent, and we use it habitually because we're unsure whether we should assign responsibility. Not sure what active or passive voice is? Here are two examples. Use active voice to say Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But using active voice, we'll say the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by Congress. The earmarks of passive voice is the expressed or implied word by. If you hear when you're reading the sentence by, consider changing that sentence's structure. This seems pedantic, but if you get into the habit of using active voice, You'll show your readers that history is about what people did, not about what merely happened. But even in its freest, most modernist sense, agency is not limitless. Before postmodernism argued that agency could not exist, some theorists posited that human-made structures, social, political, cultural, economic, limited people's capacity to act in any meaningful way. Alan Munson, again, defines structures as the existence of processes and institutions that are external to and intimately determinative of human choice. And that's a quote. Here, Munslow's really summarizing the ideas of hyperstructuralist theorists, that structures eliminate agency. But other more humanist scholars maintain that structures do not determine human action, but form a boundary on the outer limits of human agency. I personally subscribe to this, that structures form a slightly permeable boundary on human agency. Let me illustrate this with an analogy. A graphic artist, like a painter, might draw or paint a picture to the edge of the canvas that is then put into a frame. That frame around the picture is the structure that limits how far the painter can go, but does not prescribe what the painter does on the canvas inside of that frame. One way to identify structure is to look at the language that Foray and Salvoris use to talk about continuity. Social taboos, cultural norms, class hegemony, laws, traditions, and so forth. All of these are structures that change more slowly than agency. These things limit change and may even limit human agency. Let's look now at the idea of contingency in history, which in many ways is related to agency. Boiling contingency down to its essence, it means chance, accident, and opportunity. People act, but contingency sometimes explains why they acted in unexpected ways. Contingency is not only related to agency, it's related to structure. A slightly different way of explaining it is that contingency is chance and tweaks in structure that lead agents to act in ways that are neither well-ordered nor completely free. We might say that contingency is opportunity knocking so hard at a historical agent's door that that person cannot resist. Contingency forces actions or funnels choices in particular directions that might be unexpected by the historian. When you're researching and you experience a WTF moment, look for contingency. Now let's look at some examples of contingency. The classic example of contingency occurred during the U.S. Civil War. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had been whipping McClellan's Federal Army for 16 months, but in mid-September 1862, Lee's plans for engaging the Union Army at Antietam Creek in Virginia fell into Union hands through a simple error. This led to the bloody Union victory at Antietam on September 22, 1862. But more than just an unexpected Confederate loss, the Union victory at Antietam allowed President Lincoln the political space he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation that took effect on January 1st, 1863. So what was that simple mistake? As historian John Fee writes, quote, "Someone stumbled across a piece of paper rolled around 3 cigars lying in a field," unquote. Contingency. If your research question was, why did Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation when he did, your answer led back to the unexpected Union victory at Antietam, which led back to some soldier stopping to pick up 3 cigars and, oh yeah, discovering Lee's battle plans. But what of some other examples? Look closely at the path you took to attend college. What opportunities did you seize? use. Another example that historians will discuss well into the future. What effects did COVID-19 have on the world's societies in 2020 and later? If you need a bumper sticker phrase to help you think about contingency, consider the old saw by which people recognize contingency when passing the homeless. There, but for the grace of God, go I. To summarize, this lecture discussed agency and contingency in history. We defined agency as people actively participating in historical activities, that history is about human actions. Agency is the idea that people have an identity and a, quote, capacity for purposeful choice, unquote. Those choices become history. We examined the history of the idea of agency, noting that it's part and parcel of the dominant philosophical system of the 20th century Western world. Postmodernist philosophers in the late 20th century have argued that agency does not exist and that we cannot know it or the reality of history because the sources we use are corrupted. Nevertheless, for our purposes, we accept that people have agency, and one mechanism by which we can enforce that idea is by writing in the active voice. Doing so locks into our brains the notion of agency and makes it explicit on the pages of our writing. We noted that structures were a limit on agency, that people acted as though structures bound but did not determine their actions. We also noted that we can see structures in the same language that Foray and Salavoris used to describe continuity, tradition, law, taboo, and so forth. We then looked at the related concept of contingency, which we defined as chance or opportunity that forced or funneled agency in particular directions. We noted that one earmark of contingency is the unexpected turn of events, the WTF moment. Finally, we expressed contingency through the example of General Lee's plans falling into a Union soldier's hands, which led to the unexpected Union victory at the Battle of Antietam, which led to President Lincoln promulgating the Emancipation Proclamation. This then ends the lecture. As always, thanks for your attention.